This is your message of hope. When problems come, use them. When enemies persecute you, love them. These struggles are a fire, refining you into gold. Look around. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Challenge what is expected of you. This world is not your home. You are different.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good to have you with us today. Mitchell, a young man who grew up in California, and as he did, he fell in love with surfing. It was the thing that absolutely consumed him. In every possible moment when he wasn't not doing well at school, he was out surfing. And when he got to his senior year, his parents took a job outside of the country, and it wasn't possible for him to go with them and be where they were while still taking care of some of the things, schooling and otherwise, that he needed to do back at home. But staying at home as a 17-year-old wasn't exactly wise either, so his parents decided to move him out for just a year out to Cincinnati to his aunt's house. Now, I don't know if you know much about Cincinnati, but what you should know is you can't surf. Yeah, there's not a lot of waves out there. Maybe Wave Park, I don't know. I've been to one, they're terrible. But a little side story. I don't know why I'm telling you this, total side story. When I first moved here, because I did surf down in Ventura, when I moved here, I had all my stuff and I accidentally left my wetsuit inside of a bin, and it got all moldy. So I put it out on the grass and I'm washing it. And some dude drives by and he goes, "You a Navy SEAL?" And I'm like, "No." He was like, "Then what's with the wetsuit?" As if that is the only use of a wetsuit. And I said, "Surf." Did you surf here? Well, not here. We had a very awkward interaction. I'd been living here for 48 hours. Anyway, moving on. So in Cincinnati, there wasn't a lot of surfing to be done. And so, as you can imagine, a young 17-year-old California kid in Cincinnati, that didn't go well. And so he was bullied. He was made fun of. He was picked on in about every way, shape, and form. And as we've been talking, right, he had three opportunities. He could fight back and attack and resist. He could just assimilate and just kind of take his beatings and just be like, "Oh, well, it is what it is." Or he could work from inside the structure to transform the community in which he existed. And so he set about to do that and recognized that there was a similarity between California and Cincinnati, and that was rollerblading. And he decided that he would find a mentor named Wiley and get himself inside of the rollerblading community and go against the other rival high school and defeat them in the race down Devil's Backbone. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, some of you may know that I just described the beautiful plot of the 1993 smash hit Airborne, which was just my favorite movie growing up, and I thought it was just incredible. I am a bit dismayed to realize that it did not win more awards, any awards in any way, shape, or form. But here's the thing. What I just described is true of most movies and most stories in the world, and it's true of your story, and it's true of what Peter is trying to say here, that we have an opportunity to be in a culture but not of a culture, to be in something that is a little bit different, a little bit challenging, and we have three opportunities. You can either attack, you can assimilate, or you can work from inside the existing structure to transform it into something new. And so how do we actually apply that moving forward? Well, if you were with us last week, if you weren't, go ahead and check it out online. We started in on this series a couple weeks ago, but over the last few weeks, we're kind of talking about a very similar idea. And that is how you work from within a structure to transform a structure. And last week we talked about government, and this week we are talking about work. Because, I don't know if you've realized this, but the vast majority of your waking hours will be spent at work. Like the overwhelming majority of your life. And so how do you take these principles and apply them into that setting for maximum impact? And let me give you a tip. The challenge is not to overthrow the existing authorities and bosses and terrible coworkers that you have. The goal is not to get around the water cooler and start a coup. The goal is not to gossip. The goal is not to fight back, per se. But the goal is to work so well that you turn enemies into friends. I saw a study a couple weeks ago which kind of laid the foundation for a little bit of this talk. It was done by Lifeway, an organization that loves to just survey people of faith and not of faith and how they view the world. And one of the things that they were talking about in this particular study was about how Christians interact with the workplace. And what they found was over 70% of people who profess to follow Christ have no theology for their work. They have a theology for maybe, or maybe not, but how they spend their money, how they relate with people. But when it comes to work and how they work, God and work are kind of two separate things. I do my God thing over here, I do my work thing over here, and never the two shall meet. So how do you live a radically Christian life inside of an existing structure that may or may not honor your following of Jesus? Well, as we saw with last week and the government, and I didn't get any emails, so thank you. Maybe I'll just notice like, oh, the Joneses never came back, so I guess that was their email. And if you're wondering like, what? You go back, I talked about government and Christianity for like 55 minutes. My apologies. But when it comes to work, and really everything that we're going to be talking about, the goal and the challenge from Peter as he learned from Jesus is to suffer and be blessed. And so we're going to see four things. If you want to join me, I'm going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, picking right up where we left off last week. If you don't have a Bible, you can grab one. We have some stacks at either exit, and if you don't own one, grab it, take it. It is our gift to you. Or you can open up on an app, or it'll be up on the screen momentarily. But we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to go through four things to help us kind of develop a theology of work. It is going to be a practical command, a potential complication, a powerful consideration, and a personal calling. So a practical command, a potential complication, which will be fun to talk about, a powerful consideration, and a personal calling. And let me just tell you this out the gate. As a pastor, one of the things that I don't find a tremendous amount of joy in, I talked about this last week a little, that, there are certain things that I wish weren't in the Bible, and there's a lot of these types of discussions that Peter has referencing Jesus about like suffer and be blessed, suffer and be blessed. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of that message. I wish it wasn't in there. I wish it was like rebel, fight back, be disrespectful, be like really passive aggressive, and be blessed. Like that would be it'd be way easier to preach, I'll tell you that. It's like, hey, go in and be cunning, gossip a lot, be a little passive aggressive, and just take shots at them without even changing or doing anything different, and you will be blessed. And everybody will be like, oh my gosh, we have the biggest church in the country. But that's not what it says. The challenge that it says is more difficult. And so let's do our best to view the way that Jesus, through the words of Peter, would have us view our work. So let's pray and then we'll dive in together. God, we thank you for these moments where we can gather and just pause in the midst of our rhythms to see how you would like us to change our rhythms. Especially when it comes to that of work and employment and dealing with people, difficult people and circumstances. So God, would you speak in a way that only you can? Would you, by your Spirit, just kind of chink our soul at the deepest of depths, where you want us to pay attention to your word in a way that maybe we otherwise wouldn't. Jesus, we love you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start with 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. I'm just going to read the first half of the verse. So just a couple words, because in it we find our practical command. So, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. That's it. We'll start there. So here is our practical command. Our practical command. Now, a few things we need to understand about these words and translations. Be subject, again, is the same phrase that is used to communicate the idea to submit yourselves. Now, one of the things that happens when we read verses like this and we see servants, or other translations say slaves, and it starts talking slave and master, we go, whoa, 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 this is old stuff, times are new, things are changing, this is irrelevant. Before we get there, calm down. Because, especially for us in the West, with the 1700s and 1800s and history we have with the word and concept and idea of slavery, it is very difficult for us to read this the way it was intended and the context. And I will say out the gate, slavery is awful, terrible, and bad. So don't hear what I'm not saying, but it is different than what we experienced then. Case in point. For slavery in the Roman world, there were exponentially more roads into it and exponentially more roads out of it. Some studies would say that well over half of the Roman Empire would be considered slaves. And in the original language, there's actually two different words for this concept. When we think of slavery, people taken against their will and put into horrible, terrible, treacherous work for their whole life until they either die or die, that is the word doulos. And that is not the word that is used here. The word that is used here is iokatai. And iokatai means a household servant. Or another way to put it is, probably the closest thing that we have here is an employer to the household. Now, one of the brilliant things, and we don't really recognize this because obviously we're not Romans living in Rome, but one of the things that is brilliant, what Peter does, is the Romans were famous for having what is called household codes. And they had a household code for everything. They had a household code for how you eat, for how you treat each other, for how you raise your kids, for how you manage your finances, for how you pay tax. They had a set of values for everything. And so what Peter is doing is he's brilliantly taking a household Roman code and infusing it with the values of Christ. He's saying, this is how the Roman government wants you to live. I'm going to tweak it a little bit, though, and I'm going to kind of interlay it with the values of Christ. So I want you to still stay connected to how everyone's living, but I want you to do it a little differently. And then he uses the word master, which is despotoi, which is where we get the word despot, or one with absolute authority. And so there is this idea of you have someone with authority and you are in service to them. An employee, an employer, a boss, and a worker. And here is the principle that he gives. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. That is the principle, that is the command. Work hard, work well. Be the kind of employee, be the kind of worker, be the kind of person that anyone and everyone would want to hire. That when they look at you, they say, we cannot comprehend a better person, a better employee, a better worker, a better person in this role. You are absolutely incredible. Now, that seems all well and good. You're like, okay, work hard, work good, that's fine. I'm in, and at this point, we all should be in. That's going to change here in a minute. So we go to the second half of this verse, to the potential complication. Verse 18, section B. Not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. So here comes the potential complication. Because what we'd expect him to say is, you should be a good and hard and noble and just worker when your boss is the same. So when you have a boss that is good and gracious and honoring and loving and caring and compassionate, then man, give your best for him. Give your best for her. Because they are creating an environment in which you both can put your best foot forward. And we'd be like, yeah, that's the best of us. Well, I totally want to do that. But that's not what he says. He says, so it's great when you have a good boss and a good work environment and good people you work with to be the good and just and hard worker. But you also need to be this way when your boss is harsh and is not great and is unjust. The word there is scolioi, which is from where we get the word scoliosis. If your boss, if your employer, if your work is twisted, if it is corrupt, if it is off, what does he say? Rebel! Fight back! Throw it back at him, document everything, go to HR, then quit. No, that's not what he says. He looks to all of these people who are in indentured servitude to these masters. They are in an employer where they cannot hop on Indeed and find a new job. That is not an option. You are locked in this for like your life, or at least the next decade. What does he say to them? Because they come to Peter, which is why he's writing this, and go, I have a horrible master. Some are like, man, my master's great, man. Like, we're like one big family. And some of you work at a place like that, where it's a kind of one big family. And great, he would be cool, awesome. It shows Jesus, but no one's going to be like, wow, look at that guy. He works so hard. His boss is great. Like, no one writes a movie about that. It's the people who are coming to him and going, you don't understand how terrible and awful my master is. He is cruel. He is unjust. He is mean. He's terrible. And he goes, I hear you. Submit to him with respect. Like, what? Now, and I know the first thing that comes back, okay, so submit to everything? No, not everything. It's the same conversation we had last week about the government, that you submit and willingly give yourself to the best of your effort unless they ask you to do something that violates the law of God. Like, well, they want me to be mean to someone. Okay, that's not violating the law of God. I'm talking about like committing felonies and things like that. Case in point. I had a friend when we first started the church. His name was Jeff. And Jeff was working at this company. He started he was in kind of a sales position, and he was doing pretty well. And so as it happens in sales positions, when you do well, you get noticed. And when you do well and you get noticed, you get promotions. So he started to move up the ladder and get promotions and more money. And he was doing bigger and bigger deals, which made more and more money and more bonuses. And they kept telling him, hey, if you get up the ladder, then you're going to be able to become a manager, like a regional manager. And he was like, I'm all in. Like, I'm your guy. Let's do this together. Let's make a lot of money. Let's have a great time. Okay, so he's moving on up. And then he gets into the management level. And when he gets to the management level, he gets to peek behind the curtain a little bit and see kind of how things are done and why things are done and how things are decided. And what he begins to notice is a lot of the ways behind the scenes that these deals and all this money was being moved around was illegal. And that they would sell people products that they didn't ask for, and that they would charge things to people that they didn't want. And so he was like, oh my goodness, this must be just a very basic accounting error. And so he went to his boss and he said, hey boss, we got some issues here. We got some things that are being charged to people that they didn't ask for, and we got to clear this up. And the boss said, okay, so you're one of those. How about you just keep your mouth shut? How about that? He's like, I can't. I mean, this is illegal. He said, well, if you want your job, and by the way, you made a bunch of money on the backs of this coming up, so just so we're all clear, if you want your job, you'll just keep your mouth shut and tell your team to do what they're told to do. He said, I can't do that. I'll be your best employee. I will work my tail off. I will sell everything that is within the legal bounds for me to sell, but I can't do this. And they fired him from Wells Fargo. And then everything fell apart. So yes, there is a line to say, I can walk in this lane and do, yeah, and I'll be the best employee you've ever had. And you can yell at me and scream at me and call me names, and okay, yeah, whatever, I'll just put my head down and do my job. But you ask me to do something illegal, you ask me to lie to people, yeah, I can't do that. You even look all throughout the scriptures, you see someone like Joseph who was ripped out of his home and his path of his life, and he gets elevated. Not in a way that he really desired, but hey, it's what God had. And he gets all the way up to the right hand of Potiphar. And Potiphar says, I want you to do this and this and this. He says, yes, okay. Under some good conditions, some not so good conditions. And then a little while later, his wife comes and tries to come on to him and say, like, hey, my husband is away. Why don't you and I get together? He's like, ooh, I can't do that. I'll do everything else that your husband wants me to do, whether I like it or not. That I'm sorry, I can't participate in that. And it meant a tremendous amount of suffering for him. This story arc is all throughout the scriptures. We honor well, we work as hard as we possibly can, right up until the point where we're going to do something that would violate the law of God. And so, here comes the powerful consideration in verse 19. So now he's going to give us a bit of the why. Why would we even consider this? For this is the will of God, that by doing good, oh, no, I'm reading the wrong one. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Here's the powerful consideration that he's inviting us to. Let's be honest. Sometimes you and I suffer because we do dumb things. Sometimes you make a mistake at work and your boss gets pissed. That is not suffering unjustly. Okay? Never mind. That's a talk for another time. I will just say that there are times when we all do dumb stuff and we get busted for it. And to say, God, I am suffering under the wrath of my boss. He would lovingly say, no, you did that. That was your fault. That's called a consequence. That is not called suffering for the grace of God. That is called a consequence for your terrible choice. However, there are times when that is not the case. When you are putting forth your best effort and it's just never enough. And your boss is terrible and awful and cruel. Now, here's the unique thing that we should be at least aware of the environment and the circumstances of the audience of which Peter is writing to. I want you just for a moment to imagine the recipients of this letter. They had unbearable bosses who did things to them that by the grace of God we have laws against here in the United States of America. They were treated worse than you could ever fathom. The whole my boss, he pushed me to 45 hours this week. It was crazy. That is not a thing. Ending at certain times, making sure I get my lunch break, not a thing. They were horribly, horribly treated. And what does he say to them? Submit gracefully. He references later Daniel, who, again, was ripped into the custody of another government. They changed his name, and he was like, okay. And then they forced him to go to a school where he learned about what it was to understand the mysticism and magicianship of pagan gods, and he went, okay, I'll be the best student there is. And then they forced him into a government job that he didn't want. And he was like, okay, I'll be the best worker there is. And then he rose to the top and they said, now that you're at the top, we're going to ask you or mandate that you eat this food sacrificed to this idol. And he went, that's where I can't. I'll stop you right there. That's all this other stuff of go to this school and be subjected to this. Okay, yeah, that's fine, whatever. But when you ask me to worship another God, I can't. So what is the call of the Christian in the workplace? It is to do good and suffer. And where we have alignment, I will be the best there is. You have never met a better employee than me. No one will work harder. No one will be more focused. No one will be more respectful. You cannot meet someone better than me. But where we differ, I will abstain with grace. We don't have a lot of abstain with grace in our culture. We have a lot of abstain with disdain. We have a lot of that. We have a lot of abstain with a complaint to HR that he's mad and said mean things. But just to suffer well. And listen, you pay good money for these movies, just so you know. A young boy has something horrible happen to him. And he carries that trauma up into his young adulthood where he is raised up in a corrupt system. But in the midst of that corrupt system, rather than just going along with the flow and being one of everyone else in the corrupt system, he decides to pluck the few good traits and ideals from within that society and live them to the best that he possibly can. So the little bit of good that is in that community, he embodies it like no one else. But when he tries to do it, he is deeply misunderstood. And no one understands him. And no one hangs out with him. And no one can possibly understand everything that he's going through. But he still endures all the way to the end to transform an entire community. I mean, it's Batman, right? In like every other movie ever. You pay really good money for these movies, but it's really hard to live. You'll go watch this movie and be like, oh, that's so great. And then you go to work on Monday and be like, not a chance. Not me. I ain't no Batman. I don't got someone in a cave building me cool stuff to do my job. So how do you do this? And this is where it gets difficult. This is where my job as a pastor sometimes isn't great, because this advice is hard. So how do you turn a job into a joy? How do you, Colossians 3:23, work with all your heart as if working for the Lord, not for man? How do, when you go to work tomorrow and you see your boss's car and they're in before you and your whole body kind of turns cold or anxious or nervous? If you've ever been there, I know that I had a boss like that where every time I would try to beat him to the office, because then I could, in my weird, twisted way, I could control the environment. But if I noticed he was there before me, I'd get nervous, like I'd get sweaty, I'd get anxious. And this was in a church, and he was a pastor, and he was not great. So how do you do that? Because Peter says, for this is a gracious thing when, being mindful of Christ, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. And then he says later, but if when you do good and suffer for it and endure, this is a gracious thing. This is a gracious thing. He says it all the time. This is gracious. Let's just be honest. How many of you, when you go through stuff like that, you're like, oh, the grace of God. Like, this is just such a gift of grace. How terrible this is. I mean, it could be one of a few things. Could it be that the grace of God is that you are going to receive a blessing because of you enduring? Could it be a grace of God that God is going to end up transforming your entire circumstance? Or could it be that it is a grace that God will give you to endure whatever you're enduring in the moment? Yes, probably all three at different points. But here's the key that I think sometimes we often miss. When God places you, when you accept a job, most of the time we do not think to ourselves, a new assignment from the Lord. We think, sweet, I got a job. And they pay 50 cents an hour more than my last job. Woo! Like that's our mental state. We don't think like, God must have something for me here. God must have an assignment. God must have a purpose. God must have something that he is doing. So let me ask you, Christian, do you believe that God is with you here in these moments and also tomorrow at work? That he is like the same God who has the same amount of control and the same plan for your life. Because we'll sit here You'd be like, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Be like, oh, it's Sunday. And then get to work tomorrow, and this little light of mine, I'm going to put this away because it's really awkward, and I don't want anyone to. I'll just go along, and I'll just be bitter and complain and be angry and mope and be like everybody else. Because that's what the world does. And again, as we've talked in this series, then you are no different than everyone else. Oh, I hate my job. I grumble about my job all the time. You're like everyone else. You are no different than anyone else. Do you fear the Lord and trust that he will work it out? Most of the time, the way that you and I interact with our jobs, we work as if there is no God. And he has no plan. And he has abandoned me in this wasteland of my employer. And so here comes the bigger challenge, the personal calling. And this might get a little uncomfortable. So here we go. Verse 21. For to this you have been called. And what is this he's talking about? The unjust suffering for the grace of God. You've been called to it. Because, example, Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. And here comes the personal calling. You can say one of two ways about your job. Man, I hate this so much. This is awful. This is terrible. This is brutal. It's unjust. Or maybe this is something God has called me to. And here comes the difficult part. It is the will of God, not that you just show up, but that you also grow up. And that you are also not just supplemented by God to do great things, but that you are shaped by him. And sometimes, maybe the reason that you are still stuck where you're stuck is God is not done doing what he's trying to do. And he's trying to work some things in you or out of you or through you, and you're stubborn, throwing your foot down. I hate this job. I'm going to go in and do the bare minimum and complain the whole time. And God is going, I'm trying to do something in you, for your coworker, through you, for your spouse, for your family. I'm trying to shape you into someone that looks like me, but you are not going along with the program. Can suffering, can pain, can submitting to difficult things be beneficial? Because at some point you have to ask, and it's a worthy question, does this even work? Right? I mean, I could say, hey, tomorrow when you go in and your boss is in a bad mood and hurt people, and there was something that horrible happened to him on the weekend, and you're the first person he comes across and he takes it out on you, suffer well. You'd be like, well, what? Is that even going to work? Does it matter? Good question. In 2012, there was a social psychologist by the name of Robert Woodbury, and he wanted to kind of try to find this out. Actually, he was trying to prove the opposite, that this did not work. But his thought was to take it outside of America and go into missionary work. And not just any missionary, Protestant missionaries. And if a Protestant missionary went into an environment where they were mistreated, unjustly, overworked, part of a corrupt system, what happened? What happened to the missionary? What happened to the community? What happened? And his thought was that what he would see was missionaries would go in, they would be full of passion, but then over time that passion would be ripped from their soul and they would be sent crying back to America because it just didn't work. It was too hard. That's what he hoped to find. That is not what he found. This is what he said. The work of Protestant missionaries turns out to be the single most influencing factor in ensuring the health of any nation they inhabit. What we discovered is that in areas where missionaries have had a significant presence, they leave behind, on average, regions that are more economically developed, have comparably better health, higher literacy, lower corruption, lower infant mortality, and he goes on and on and on and on and on to talk about the benefit of Christians simply existing in a system and not bowing to the system and not being like everyone else and saying, you know what, we're going to live differently in the midst of the system. Now, he does acknowledge that there were, a few bad apples and a few narcissists and things like that. He doesn't want to say, oh, no, everyone's perfect. No, he acknowledges that. But if that was the norm, right, just men and women out for their own sake to make a name for themselves in whatever way that looks like, then the places would be worse off than when they left. But the complete opposite was true. And then he said something else interesting. He said, it seems to be that this is true mostly of conversionary missionaries. Now, conversionary missionaries is a made-up term. That is not a thing. I don't know what a conversionary missionary is, but he believed that a conversionary missionary was someone who had the sole intent of going to live differently so that people might meet Jesus. And when they showed up, they went, hey, just so you know, there's this man who claimed to be God, and he died for your sin and mine, and he offers forgiveness. That is what their sole purpose was. And he said, I go on with his quote, many of these missionaries did oppose terrible things like abortion, opioid addiction, slavery, and more. But none of them actually worked as government activists. Yet the transformation still came. It seemed almost to come from the back door and was an unintended consequence of these missionaries, which completely misses the point. He didn't understand what we were trying to do, and so it makes sense that he wouldn't understand that, no, this is actually what Jesus is talking about, is that when you go into a system and you say, well, I'm not going to fight against it, I'm not going to assimilate, I'm going to transform within it. And I'm going to allow God to work in and through me, that things would actually begin to change. This word that he uses in here, when he says, leaving you an example, that word example, the word there is hypogrammon, and it is a school term used by the Romans, which in some ways we still kind of use today. That means to follow after an outline. And so what they would do, and if you've ever had a student try to learn how to write and it's not going particularly well, or even at the beginning of writing, all my kids did this, is they give you something to look at and something to trace and something to model. And the goal is to always stay what? Within the lines. Yep, stay within the lines. I don't know why, but because sometimes you can create some cool art. At least that's what my kids called it. But the goal is that you would just follow after these lines, and after a while, what you are drawing would actually look something like the intended consequence of what you set out to draw. But it's really hard sometimes when you don't have anything to follow. You end up just drawing random lines, and then you step back and look at it, and it really doesn't look like much. But if you actually have something to follow and something to look at and something to, in this way, trace your life over, then you can actually create something quite beautiful. And so the goal is the same, because obviously our life is to be modeled after Jesus. That is the thing that we are to be centering our lives over, that we should look something like, that we should live different because. And for many of us, when we go into our work and we begin to overlay our life, it doesn't look much like this. But that is the goal. That is the hypogrammon. That is the example. The example that is shown later on in verse 22, when it says, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So what would it look like for you to trace your life and begin to model yourself around Jesus when it comes to work. Some of you, when you go into work tomorrow and people start talking crap about someone else in the office and you just don't dive in, and they're like, I mean, yeah, am I right? And they look to you and you're like, well, I mean, I think they're doing a real good job. I mean, their hair is nice. I don't know how to do this. I'm sorry. This needs practice. I'm used to just berating them. It's weird. And it's going to be weird. And you're going to be so used to just bagging on people and bagging on situations and bagging on your boss that actually being a person that looks like Jesus might be more difficult than you think. Or you don't lie. When your boss asks you the status of a project, you just tell them the truth. Yeah, I'm behind. And I'll get to that as soon as I can. Or when things just seem terrible, you actually try to find it as a blessing to say, God, thank you for providing for me. Thank you that I have worked, and I will do everything I can to shape myself, to trace my life on yours so that I actually look something like you to my coworkers, because I've said this a million times. A lot of your coworkers are not going to read the Bible. They're going to read you. A lot of your coworkers may not ever find themselves in this place, but they're going to look to you and say, this person loves this Jesus guy, and I don't know if there's anything in their life that looks remotely like him in any way, shape, or form, but you know what? There's something different about them. Because when the boss comes down on all of us, it just ruins all of our weeks, but it doesn't seem to faze them as bad. Yeah, it's not great, and they acknowledge that, but it doesn't just wipe them out for the week. It's kind of weird. I don't understand. They seem to like it in a weird way. I don't know. It's weird. I just don't, they work harder because of it. I don't know. In hopes that you may be able to show them Jesus. That is why we live the way that we do. Yes, there are blessings. Yes, Jesus gives us more than we could ever imagine, but more than that, it is so that other people in your life will see Jesus, that your life would look like a tracing of someone far greater than your boss and your employee, your other employees, and everyone else you work with, because you work for the King. And you take a completely different approach than everyone else, and that it may actually give you the opportunity to live like Jesus in a culture that doesn't really honor it. Amen? Let's pray. God, we thank you for this challenge, and I recognize that for some there is, this isn't just a random theology. There's like a name and a face attached to the other side of this. A name and a face that when that name and face comes to mind, it causes severe anxiety and worry and fear and nervousness. And so, God, I pray that you would allow us to see the person above them, you, who we are ultimately serving. That we work hard, we work well for you. And where we differ in value, we abstain with grace. But where we align, you'll never find anyone better. That we would live differently in relation to our government and live differently in relation to our work. That we would actually have a theology for work that tells us when we go to work, we are working as if we're working directly for Jesus, not for man. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray.